Also, I want to speak about copyright, and I should declare my interest, as my main activity outside this House is in producing copyright material and selling it in book form and very substantially on the internet. And the basic protections that copyright law offers are extremely important to me. Nonetheless, my lords, I do think that this bill has to be very careful to look after the proper interests of its citizens. We have always, my lords, allowed citizens leeway under copyright law. You can lend books to friends. You can even copy your, as has been said, copy your music and put it on different kit. It is well known that newspapers are read by many more people than buy them, and certainly I am happy to borrow them on buses when they're left behind. People have got use, and I think it is entirely reasonable, to a reasonable level of sharing between friends and within a small community of copyright material, so that it doesn't have to be purchased again at every incidence when it is used. And the figures that are produced for the loss that is incurred by the creative industries from illegal downloading, my lords, no, the figures produced are not the loss, they are the infringement of copyright. It is not at all certain how many of those songs or films would actually have been purchased if people had had to pay for them. Many of the people doing this are not in a position to pay for more than they pay for already. So one must be careful in the terminology one uses. And I think we have to be careful too about the industry cloaking itself in the finery of the small creative individual. My lords, we are not talking about the small creative individual here. We are talking about powerful monopolistic industries, and giving them power over our citizens is something that we ought to be careful of. The principal one, which I haven't heard mentioned in, well, I've heard it mentioned in one briefing I've received, but not in any speeches today, is the industry of pornography. Very widely used on the internet, one of the most assiduous in pursuing people for supposed non-payment for illegal downloads, etc. We have to face that we are putting a lot of people into the hands of pornographers and their lawyers if we are not careful about the way we draft this bill. The recording industry is another major beneficiary of what we're doing here. Recording industry is not exactly known for kindness to creative people. There are many, many people who have created individual bits of music and sold it to rapacious recording companies for £100 or a couple of £100, only to see the company go on to make vast sums out of it. The relationship there is not equal, and we are, as I say, we're not dealing with the benefit of the small creative, we're dealing with the benefit to a powerful and monopolistic industry. My lords, we're asked also to protect football and presumably the interests of Mr. Murdoch when it comes to putting the Times behind a paid-for wall on the net. And in that context, I am delighted to support what the Noble Lord Maddleson said about the BBC. I am 100% behind his resistance to Mr. Murdoch's demands when it comes to that. And I think we also need to bear in mind, my lords, that the problems that the industry is facing now are, to quite a large extent, of their own creation. They have been extremely slow to listen to the demands of their customers. They have had something of an abusive relationship with them, seeking to punish them before they have before thinking of how they can serve them better. It has taken a decade for them to produce sensible alternatives to illegal file sharing. And the fact that a generation of people have got used to illegality really comes down to their sluggishness in that. And they are still slow. My lords, the football people were complaining about the fact that there are sites where you can go and download streaming video of Premier Division matches. My lords, all they offer is an annual contract to watch the things for several £100. They won't offer per match at a reasonable price. So if you're treating your customers that way, they should not be surprised that they try and get round that. And we ought to understand, the Noble Lord Mance, I think, put it quite well when he talked about moving them forward in producing better business models. We ought not to be producing legislation here which fossilises the creative industry in this unsatisfactory relationship with their customers. We ought to be making sure that what we produce here is something where there's a real incentive to move the industry forward. And where little things that get complained of, like the immense sluggishness in rights clearances, and I have come across that to some extent, these things absolutely have to be dealt with by the industry. There should be, underlying this bill, a real quid pro quo. My Lords, what I want to see, based on what's in this bill, is a really ISP-friendly, customer-friendly system for backing us out of our addiction to illegal downloads. The first letter that comes from an ISP to the customer ought to be helpful and friendly and explanatory, to be something that really gives people the information they need without making them feel they're criminals in the way that the BBC does, for instance, when they send out a letter to someone they think has not paid the licence fee. It is very important to get the text of that letter right, and I hope that we will set in place a system where the text of that letter is under the control of Ofcom or the government and not of individual copyright holders or of ISPs. Secondly, I think it ought to be compulsory for copyright holders to go through the mechanism we're putting in place. I don't think it's acceptable that we're putting in place a mechanism for them to deal with peer-to-peer file sharing, and they can still go immediately to lawyers and harass people in that way, as the pornography industry do already, and has, in the briefing which Noble Lords will have received from which, the consequences, I think, of that are well described, and that is something we should take the opportunity of this bill to stamp out. Thirdly, the appeal system must be good and clear and set out. And what we should be offering our citizens is due process, not something that is summary. Losing one's internet connection in the digital age is a very severe disadvantage. Losing it because you happen to be sharing your internet connection with other members of your family, or indeed under current British Telecom arrangements, you're letting your neighbours use it. That, my Lords, is something that we have to be careful of, and I'm not at all clear that we actually have the technology to go beyond the IP address, which is, as it were, coming into my router, to actually identify which user, out of perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen who have access to that router, actually was doing the illegal downloading. So I think we need to be very clear that we are not going to tip people into losing their internet connection or worse on the basis, on a technically fallible basis. And my Lords, if I have one last request to my front bench, it is, please can we vote against Clause 17?